After another one of her schemes, my wife came home from her work event to find a text message on her phone saying I finally had enough and we're getting divorced. Hey Reddit, my name is Tyler and I'm 29 years old. This is the story of the night that changed everything. The night I finally stopped being a fool in someone else's narrative and started writing my own. It was 3:15 a.m. when I finally stopped driving. I had no plan, no hotel booked, and absolutely no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I needed to be far enough away that her voice couldn't reach me anymore. Not her real voice, not the one she used to beg for space or whine about work dinners. And definitely not the voice that kept echoing in my head, replaying the way she said I love you just the night before. Like it was some kind of password she didn't want to forget. The parking lot where I ended up was completely empty. There was nothing but the steady hum of my engine and the harsh buzz of a nearby streetlight cutting through the darkness. I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles and stared straight ahead, not really seeing anything in front of me. I wasn't crying. Hell, I didn't even feel angry anymore. What I felt was so much worse than that. I felt completely hollow, like someone had been slowly scooping me out over the past year, and I'd been too distracted to notice until I was nothing but skin wrapped around empty air. I didn't want this to be my life, but here I was, sitting in a stranger's parking lot at 3 in the morning, running from the woman I'd promised to love forever. Her name is Victoria, though most people just call her Vic. On Instagram, she goes by Vic Martinez, and you've probably seen her type before. Perfect hair that never seems to have a bad day, carefully curated brunch photos with just the right lighting, and those fake deep captions about loyalty and positive energy that make you want to roll your eyes. She's the kind of person who will post a throwback picture of us from our trip to Cancun, complete with a heart emoji and a #blessed tag, while simultaneously texting another man under the dinner table. The worst part? She met him at work. There was no big dramatic moment, no suspicious text message that gave everything away. It was so much slower and more insidious than that. Like a faucet that drips so quietly, you don't notice it until the damage is already done. First came the longer hours at the office. Then came the vague explanations when I asked about her day. But the real shift was in how she started treating me. She began correcting me more, laughing at things I said that she used to find endearing. Suddenly, everything I did was a lot. I breathed too loud during movies. I double texted when she didn't respond right away. I folded the towels wrong. Hell, according to her, I even walked too loud in the mornings. I used to just ignore it and write it off as stress. We'd fought about the usual stuff that couples grind through. Money, kids we might want someday, whose turn it was to do the dishes. But these last 6 months, there was something else living between us. Something I couldn't name or identify. It was like a third person in our relationship, invisible but always present, always making everything feel slightly off-kilter. I couldn't put my finger on what it was until I found the emails. She left her laptop open that Tuesday afternoon. Not even password protected. Just sitting there on our kitchen table like she was practically inviting me to look. Part of me still wonders if she wanted me to find it. If some buried part of her conscience was tired of carrying the weight of what she'd been doing behind my back. I wasn't snooping, I swear. I was just trying to grab some files off the desktop for our insurance paperwork. Something mundane and domestic that married couples do without thinking twice about it. That's when I noticed a folder labeled Quarterly Reports. Seemed innocent enough, so I clicked on it thinking maybe there was something work-related I needed to know about. Inside were PDFs and spreadsheets, all the normal corporate stuff you'd expect to find. But underneath all of that was an Outlook export file, the kind I recognize from my own job when you need to back up email conversations. My stomach started to twist even before I opened it. Some primitive instinct already warning me that I was about to see something I couldn't unsee. When I clicked on that file, it dumped every single sent message into a local folder on her computer. There were 213 emails in total. 213 messages that painted a picture I never could have imagined in my worst nightmares. The first email was dated exactly 6 months ago. Blake, thanks for the talk today. You're easy to open up to. Innocent enough on the surface, right? The kind of message you might send to any friendly coworker after a good conversation. But it didn't stay innocent for long. Just 3 emails later, the tone had already shifted. I haven't laughed like that in months. Then, a few days after that, don't worry, Tyler doesn't suspect anything. Tyler doesn't suspect anything. She was talking about me like I was some clueless obstacle in her path, some naive husband who was too stupid to notice what was happening right under his nose. She called me a routine. She said I was safe, boring, predictable. She told Blake that he reminded her of who she used to be before she settled down with someone like me. The bile that rose in my throat when I read those words, I can't even begin to describe it. It was like being punched in the stomach and having your heart ripped out at the same time. I wish I could say I stopped reading there, that I had enough dignity to close the laptop and walk away. But I didn't. I couldn't. I read every single word, every last message in that folder, because I needed to know exactly how deep this betrayal went. I needed to understand how far she'd fallen without me noticing. This was the woman who used to fall asleep with her head on my chest, listening to my heartbeat like it was her favorite song. Now she was writing actual poems about another man's hands. She was describing in explicit detail what she wanted to do to him, what she wanted him to do to her. She was making plans to meet him at hotels, talking about how alive he made her feel, how their connection was something special and rare. When I finally reached the end of that digital paper trail, I just sat there for the longest time, staring at the screen until my eyes burned. Then I closed the laptop very carefully and left it sitting on the table exactly where I'd found it, like it was some kind of dead bird that had fallen from the sky. That's when I started packing. Not frantically, not in some dramatic, rage-fueled frenzy. Just calm and methodical, like I was preparing for a business trip. Toothbrush, a few t-shirts, my passport, the flash drive with my important documents. I didn't take everything, just what I'd need to get through the next few days, maybe weeks, while I figured out what came next. Before I walked out of that house for what I knew would be the last time, I grabbed a yellow sticky note from the kitchen counter. I wrote 5 simple words in black ink. I finally had enough. I didn't sign it with my name, didn't add any explanation or demands. I didn't text her or call her or wait around to hear whatever pathetic excuses she might try to offer. Whatever thin slice of truth she'd wrap in lies and present to me like it was some kind of mercy. I just walked out the door and started driving into the night, and that's how I ended up in that empty parking lot, staring into the darkness and feeling like I'd left something crucial behind, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted it back anymore. The uncertainty of what came next was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating. I didn't know where I would sleep that night, didn't know what my life would look like tomorrow or next week, but I knew with absolute certainty that I was done being the fool in the story she told herself to make her betrayal feel justified. What surprised me most was that she didn't call. Not right away, anyway. I'd been bracing myself for the inevitable flood of panicked text messages, the barrage of missed calls, maybe some forced hysteria about where I was and whether I was okay. I expected the usual dramatic performance. "Where are you? Are you safe? We need to talk right now." But instead, the hours just ticked by in complete silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence either. This was charged silence, the kind that makes the air feel electric, like a storm is building just beyond the horizon, and something is about to break. I found myself checking my phone every 5 minutes, even though I'd sworn I wouldn't give her that power over me anymore. Even though I'd turned off all my notifications and flipped the phone face down on the cheap motel nightstand, it felt like it was staring at me, taunting me with its blank screen. But there was nothing. She wasn't looking for me that first night, wasn't worried about where I'd gone or whether I was safe. That silence told me everything I needed to know about where I really stood in her priorities. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there on a mattress so thin I could feel every spring in the frame underneath, in a room that reeked of industrial-strength bleach and decades of disappointment. I stared at the water-stained ceiling tiles like they might have answers written on them somewhere, but they were just as lost as I was. My mind kept dragging me backward against my will, pulling up memories I didn't want to revisit. Like that dinner at her parents' house last fall, when her father had poured me a generous glass of his good bourbon and told me, with genuine warmth in his voice, "You're good for her, Tyler. You keep her grounded." I found myself wondering if he knew what his daughter had become. I wondered if he'd seen the signs too, and just hadn't wanted to admit that his little girl was capable of this kind of cruelty. The silence finally broke the next morning like a dam bursting. Victoria had apparently decided that 12 hours was long enough to let me stew in my own anger. Her first text came in at exactly 8:12 a.m., and it was just 4 words. "Are you seriously gone?" Not even a question mark. Not a single word asking where I was or if I was okay. No apology, no acknowledgement of what she'd done. Just pure, casual disbelief. Like I'd left a pair of socks in the dryer and made some huge dramatic production out of it. I stared at that message for 10 solid minutes, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, trying to decide if there was anything worth saying back to her. In the end, I didn't respond. What was the point? At 8:40, she sent another message. Can we talk? Still no question mark, still no apology. It was 8:12 a.m., which meant she was probably sitting in that ridiculous white bathrobe she always wore after her morning showers. I used to think that look was sexy, the way the terry cloth clung to her damp skin, the way her hair fell in wet waves over her shoulders. Now all I could think about was how many times she'd dried off after being with him. How many mornings she'd come home to me still smelling like Blake's cologne. I didn't respond to that message either. The call started at 8:40. I let the first one ring out completely, watching her name flash on my screen until it went to voicemail. Then she called again at 8:43, and once more at 8:51. Finally, she left me a voicemail that perfectly captured everything wrong with who she'd become. Tyler, what the fuck is this? You're acting completely insane. Her voice came through the speaker, sharp with irritation rather than concern. You left a sticky note? Are you 12 years old? Just call me back so we can talk about this like adults. Talk like adults. Like adults who keep devastating secrets from each other. Like adults who live in the same house and pretend not to notice when the other person stops loving them back. Like adults who call betrayal a rough patch and expect forgiveness to come as easily as an apology. I saved the voicemail but didn't call her back. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Wasn't prepared to hear her try to rewrite history and make me the villain in her story. At 11:03 a.m., she sent me a wall of text that was so perfectly Victoria, it almost made me laugh. It started with, "You've been distant too," and ended with, "Maybe if you actually made me feel wanted, I wouldn't have looked elsewhere." Classic deflection wrapped up in a bow of victimhood. There it was, the confession I'd been waiting for, but wrapped in blame like it was my fault she'd decided to destroy our marriage. She was already rewriting the narrative, painting herself as the neglected wife who'd been forced to seek attention elsewhere because her husband was too emotionally unavailable to meet her needs. But then, like she couldn't help herself, like the truth was clawing its way out of her throat, came the real moment of honesty. "I didn't mean for it to go that far with Blake, it just happened," she wrote. "I felt alive again. You don't get it. Alive again." Those two words hit me like a perfectly aimed punch to the gut. I remembered the last time she'd said that exact phrase to me. It was on our anniversary last year, at that beachside cabin I'd saved up 6 months to book for us. We'd lit a fire in the fireplace, opened an expensive bottle of wine, and she'd leaned against my shoulder and whispered, "This makes me feel alive." I'd thought it was one of the most romantic things she'd ever said to me. Apparently, sneaking around behind my back and planning hotel rendezvous with her coworker made her feel alive too. I still didn't reply to any of her messages. I wasn't ready for that conversation, wasn't prepared to let her drag me into whatever twisted version of reality she was constructing to make herself feel better about what she'd done. But I couldn't just sit in that stale motel room replaying everything over and over again in my head. I needed to move, needed to do something, anything, to break the cycle of thoughts that kept pulling me under. So I got in my car and drove 2 towns over to a little cafe I used to take her to back when we were just dating. It was one of those places with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls. The kind of spot that felt warm and authentic in a world full of corporate chains. The barista didn't recognize me. It had been years since we'd been there together, and I was grateful for the anonymity. I sat by the window at a small table for 2, ordered black coffee with no food because I wasn't hungry, and tried to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. That's when my phone buzzed with another message from Victoria, and this one made me realize just how far gone she really was. It was a photo. A picture of our bedroom, specifically the bedside table where I'd left that sticky note. The note was in perfect focus in the center of the frame, and in the corner of the image, you could see her hand flipping off the camera. Under the photo, she'd written, "You're a coward." I swear to God I smiled when I saw that. It wasn't joy, wasn't even relief. It was the quiet, gritty grin of a man who just realized he wasn't losing his mind after all. She was exactly who she'd revealed herself to be over these past months. All those nights I'd stayed awake wondering if I was being paranoid, if I was imagining the distance between us, if I was crazy for feeling like something was fundamentally wrong. They were all answered in that single image. She'd shown me her true character with that photo. While I was wrestling with heartbreak and betrayal, trying to process the destruction of everything I'd believed about our relationship, she was taking pictures of my pain and mocking it. She was treating the end of our marriage like it was some kind of social media drama, something to be documented and shared for maximum impact. I didn't respond to that message either. I just saved the picture to my phone because I knew something she didn't yet understand. I was done being polite, done trying to protect her feelings or preserve whatever dignity our relationship might have left. And I hadn't even started the real part yet. I made a decision that afternoon. I was going to stay completely off the grid for 2 full days. No social media, no contact with mutual friends, no responses to anything she sent me. I wanted to let her stew in the silence, let her imagination run wild about where I was and what I was thinking. For once in our relationship, she was going to be the one left wondering, the one without control. I could picture her pacing around our kitchen, well, her kitchen now, calling her sister to spin some twisted version of events that made her look like the victim. "He just snapped," I bet she told everyone who would listen. "He's being so emotional about everything." That was always her favorite word when things didn't go her way. Emotional. Like having feelings about your wife's affair was some kind of character flaw. Like being hurt by betrayal was an overreaction. What she didn't understand was that emotional was exactly what love looked like when it was breaking apart in your hands. But Victoria had never been good at recognizing real emotions. She preferred the manufactured drama of her secret relationship to the genuine intimacy we'd built together over years. By day 3, the tone of her messages had shifted completely. I woke up to 13 missed calls and 5 voicemails on my phone. She'd gone from cold and dismissive to frantic in less than 48 hours, and I could practically feel her panic radiating through the screen. That's what happens when someone like Victoria loses control of the narrative, when the person who always came home stops knocking on the door. The voicemails were fascinating to listen to because they were layered like an archaeological dig through her emotional state. The first one was snide and bitter, still trying to maintain her position of superiority. The second was angrier, more demanding. But by the third, something had shifted. Her voice was quiet, almost vulnerable, like the mask had finally cracked under the weight of her own performance. "Tyler, please don't just disappear like this," she said in that third message. And for a moment, she almost sounded like the woman I'd fallen in love with years ago. "You don't know the whole story. It wasn't supposed to mean anything." There was a long pause where I could hear her breathing, could almost picture her standing in our living room, trying to find the right words. "I didn't want to lose you." I listened to that voicemail twice, not because I was moved by it, but because I needed to hear the way she said those words. She talked about not wanting to lose me like I was a pair of car keys she'd misplaced in a hurry. Something valuable that she didn't want to lose but wasn't exactly holding on to either. Then came the real kicker, the message that made everything crystal clear. "Let's just come home and talk. I miss you. I love you. We can fix this." Fix this. Like our marriage was a cracked dinner plate, not a house that had been burned to the ground. Like trust was something you could repair with superglue and good intentions. I finally decided to break my silence, but not in the way she was expecting. I sent her a single text message. "Tell Blake it's over, then I'll call." She didn't reply for a full hour. I watched the message sit there with no response, no typing indicator, just silence that spoke volumes about where her priorities really lay. When her response finally came, it was 2 words that told me everything I needed to know. "It's complicated." That's when I saw red. I stood up so fast from my motel room chair that it nearly fell over backward. Complicated. After everything we'd been through, after the lies and the emails and the voicemail where she'd begged another man to book a hotel room in Atlanta, she had the audacity to tell me that ending her affair was complicated. I stared at that message like it was written in fire, my thumbs hovering over my phone's keyboard for what felt like hours. Finally, I typed back, "You're not sorry, you're cornered. That's not the same thing." Then I put the phone away and walked into the nearest bookstore, hoping that being surrounded by shelves and pages would somehow keep my hands from shaking with rage. I didn't expect her to show up at my motel. That night around 9:30, there was a soft knock on my door that made my entire body freeze. At first, I thought maybe it was housekeeping or another guest who'd gotten the wrong room number. But then, the knocking got louder, more insistent, and I heard her voice calling through the thin door. "Tyler, open the door." She didn't sound angry or demanding like I'd expected. She didn't sound sweet and manipulative either. She just sounded tired, like she'd been screaming in her car for 20 miles before she'd worked up the courage to say anything out loud. I stood there for a long moment, my hand on the door handle, trying to decide if I was ready for whatever conversation was about to happen. Finally, I opened the door. She looked absolutely terrible. Her hair was pulled up in a messy bun. She wasn't wearing any makeup, and she had on an oversized hoodie I hadn't seen in over a year. My stomach turned when I realized it was probably Blake's. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in months. I didn't move from the doorway at first. "You drove all the way here." She shrugged, like it was no big deal, like tracking down your estranged husband at a roadside motel was just a normal Tuesday evening activity. "You weren't answering your phone." I didn't know what else to do. I stepped back and led her into the room, not because I'd forgiven her or because I wanted to reconcile, but because I wanted to see if she'd finally tell me the truth to my face. I wanted to watch her try to explain away months of lies and betrayal while looking directly into my eyes. She sat down on the edge of the bed like it belonged to her, like she hadn't just shattered something sacred between us. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched out uncomfortably until she finally broke it. "I fucked up," she said simply. I nodded. "You did?" "I didn't plan it," she continued, her voice taking on that familiar defensive tone. "It just spiraled out of control. At first it was just attention, just someone at work who listened to me and made me laugh. Then it turned into something else, and I didn't know how to stop it." "I didn't think you'd find out like that," she added, like the method of discovery was somehow more important than the betrayal itself. "So you were going to keep lying to me?" I asked. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Then she had the absolute audacity to say it. "You weren't really there anymore either, Tyler. You barely touched me anymore. You were always working late or distracted. You—" "Don't," I cut her off, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Don't you dare try to turn this into my fault. I didn't sleep with someone else because I felt lonely. I asked you if you were okay. I tried to reconnect with you. You're the one who chose to look for what you needed in someone else's bed." She folded her arms across her chest defensively. "So what now? You want a divorce?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I looked at her sitting there on that cheap motel bed, in another man's clothes, asking me what I wanted like she still had any say in the direction of our relationship. "I don't want anything from you," I said, and the words felt like stones falling from my mouth. "That's the point. I'm done wanting anything from you." That shut her up completely. She looked around the room then, really looked at it for the first time. The dim lighting, the water-stained ceiling, the single bed with its threadbare comforter. And I think it finally hit her that I'd chosen this. I'd chosen this nothing room, this anonymous space, this complete absence of comfort over coming home to her. For the first time in years, Victoria didn't have the last word. She stood up slowly and walked to the door, hesitating with her hand on the handle. Then she turned back to me one more time. "Just so you know," she said, "he meant nothing to me." I actually laughed. I didn't want to, but the sound came out anyway, short and bitter and completely humorless. "Then you gave up everything for nothing," I told her. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and I was left alone in the quiet again. But this time, the silence didn't hurt. I didn't sleep after she left, but not for the reasons you might think. It wasn't because I was tortured or torn up about what had just happened. That ship had already sailed, hit an iceberg, and sunk to the bottom of the ocean. What kept me awake was something else entirely, a profound stillness that I hadn't felt in months. It was the kind of quiet that follows a storm so violent and loud that it scrapes you completely raw, leaving nothing behind but cracked windows and damp silence. She had shown up at my motel room expecting, I don't even know what. Maybe a breakdown, maybe a screaming fight, maybe a door-slamming, dramatic exit. Or perhaps she'd been hoping for some desperate attempt on my part to pull her back into the wreckage of what we used to be. But I had nothing left to offer her, and that realization was strangely liberating. That's what I understood as I lay there staring at the ceiling fan spinning its lazy, hypnotic circles in the dim light of that anonymous room. I didn't want her back. Not some reformed version of her, not the memory of who she used to be, not even her regret or her promises to change. I was completely, utterly done. Around 6 a.m., I packed up my few belongings and checked out of the motel. I left the room key on the counter without saying a word to the front desk girl, who smiled at me with the kind of too polite expression that suggested she'd witnessed these kinds of checkouts more often than she cared to admit. There's something universal about the look of a man leaving a place he never intended to stay. I drove without any destination in mind, no map, no GPS, just following my instincts and taking whatever roads felt right. By noon, I found myself sitting at a rest stop overlooking an endless stretch of nothing. There were fields as far as I could see, distant trees marking some invisible property line, and a sky that looked like it hadn't quite made up its mind about what kind of day it wanted to be. That's when my phone buzzed with a message from Victoria's sister, Lisa. Hey, I don't want to get in the middle of this, but Vic is not doing well. She's been crying nonstop and hasn't eaten anything in 2 days. Please just talk to her. I stared at that message for a long time, watching the words blur together as my eyes unfocused. Then I did something I hadn't done since this whole nightmare started. I called someone. Not Victoria, not Lisa, but my friend David. David and I go back 15 years. He was the best man at our wedding, had moved out of state about 2 years ago for work, but we'd managed to keep in touch despite the distance. He was the one person in my life who would tell me the brutal truth without wrapping it in sympathy or trying to make me feel better about things that couldn't be fixed. He picked up on the second ring. Tyler. I couldn't speak at first. The words were there, but they felt too heavy to lift. Hey, he said, and I could hear his tone shift to something more serious. You all right, man? She cheated, I said, my voice coming out completely flat and emotionless. It's been going on for months. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. You want me to say something helpful, or do you want me to be honest? He asked. Honest. You knew, he said without hesitation. Deep down, you've known for a while now. You just didn't want to admit it to yourself, because when you love someone that much, your brain starts lying to your heart to protect it. That hit me harder than I'd expected. We talked for over an hour after that, and David didn't sugarcoat anything. He told me I needed to start thinking practically about what came next. Property division, shared finances, finding a lawyer. I realized with a start that I hadn't even begun to consider the mundane realities of dismantling a marriage. The house we'd bought together, the bank accounts we'd merged, the dog we'd rescued 2 summers ago when we still believed in forever. Victoria had destroyed us emotionally, but the cleanup was going to be slow and cold and surgical. It was going to take months, maybe years, to fully untangle our lives from each other. Victoria texted me again that night with a message that caught me off guard. Can we just sit down one more time? Not to fight, just to talk. I owe you that. I should have ignored it. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to delete the message and block her number. But something about the way she phrased it made me pause. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was some misguided sense of closure. But I found myself agreeing to meet her one final time. I suggested a neutral location, an old park downtown that neither of us had any particular memories attached to. No house with its bedroom nostalgia, no restaurant where we'd shared romantic dinners. Just a bench, some wind, and the occasional stranger walking by with their own problems to worry about. She showed up wearing sunglasses even though it was overcast, like hiding her eyes would somehow make her less exposed or vulnerable. I stayed standing while she sat down on the bench and crossed her legs, waiting a beat before she started speaking. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said, her voice quieter than I'd heard it in months. I know I ruined everything between us. Then why are we here? I asked, genuinely curious about what she hoped to accomplish. Because you're still the only person I trust to tell me the truth, she said. And that admission stung more than I wanted it to. I wasn't happy, she continued, the words tumbling out like she'd been rehearsing them. And I didn't know how to tell you that without making you hate me. And then Blake came along and just paid attention to me. He listened when I talked. It was stupid and reckless, but it made me feel seen again in a way I hadn't felt in so long. I let her talk, watching every word fall from her lips like stones being thrown into a lake I no longer swam in. Every explanation felt like an excuse, every justification like another small betrayal. I kept telling myself I'd end it before it got serious, she went on, her voice getting smaller and more desperate. But by the time I realized how far I'd gone, I didn't know how to fix it without completely destroying you in the process. I looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time since she'd sat down. She wasn't broken or devastated like I might have expected. She wasn't even particularly sorry in the way that mattered. What she was, I realized, was cornered. She was ashamed, maybe, but not sorry in the deep, soul-crushing way that comes with truly understanding the magnitude of what you've done to someone you claim to love. You didn't destroy me, I told her, my voice steady and clear. You destroyed the version of me that trusted you completely. The rest of me, the real me, he's going to recover just fine. She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the ring she was still wearing. So that's it then? Yeah, I said without hesitation. That's it. She nodded once, a sharp, definitive movement that seemed to acknowledge the finality of what was happening between us. I turned to leave, ready to walk away from this conversation and this chapter of my life for good. But then she called my name one more time. Tyler. I stopped but didn't turn around. do you think we ever had a chance at making it work again? If things had been different? I didn't even have to think about my answer. No, not after what you chose to do. And with that, I walked away. I didn't cry, didn't look back, didn't feel the crushing weight of regret or loss that I might have expected. That night, I booked a new apartment, small and unfurnished, but completely mine. Because the moment I finally let go of her, truly and completely, was the first moment I started coming back to myself. The apartment I found was absolutely bare bones, white walls, thin carpet, and the kind of generic fixtures you get when you're renting a place month to month. It was the sort of space you choose when you're not entirely sure whether you're building a new life or just escaping from your old one. My mattress sat directly on the floor for the first few weeks. I had no couch, no dining table, just a folding chair and a cardboard box that served as my makeshift coffee table. But you know what? That silence in my new place didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt honest in a way that nothing had felt honest in years. I made a conscious decision not to tell anyone where I'd moved, not even my parents. I needed distance from well-meaning sympathy more than I needed support. I couldn't handle the tilted heads and soft voices asking, "How are you holding up?" As if heartbreak followed some predetermined timeline, as if there was a schedule for when I should be feeling better. Victoria stopped texting after our conversation in the park. 3 days of complete radio silence, no fake check-ins, no middle of the night just thinking of you messages. She went completely quiet. And somehow that silence was louder and more telling than all her previous attempts at communication. It meant she finally understood that I wasn't bluffing, that this wasn't some dramatic gesture designed to get her attention or make her fight for our relationship. Then, on a Thursday morning just past 10 a.m., I got an email from her. The subject line was just one word: closure. Not even capitalized, like she couldn't be bothered to put in the effort for proper grammar. The email itself was 6 paragraphs long, and I won't reproduce the whole thing here because, frankly, it wasn't worth the digital space it occupied. But it was exactly what you'd expect from someone like Victoria: a carefully curated apology, strategically constructed regret, and absolutely no real acceptance of responsibility. It read like she was trying to narrate her own redemption arc, like this was all just material for some future podcast about personal growth and learning from mistakes. She wrote, "I never wanted to be the villain in our story," which was rich considering she'd spent months actively choosing to be exactly that. But what really twisted the knife was a line she buried near the end. "I just hope someday we can laugh about all of this." Laugh. That's what she thought this was all leading to? Some future coffee meetup where we'd swap stories about the people we became after she set fire to the version of me that loved her without question. That email was the moment I decided to stop mourning what we'd lost and start focusing on what I could reclaim. I didn't respond to her message. Instead, I started making lists, practical ones, about what I needed to buy, who I needed to contact, which accounts needed to be closed, and which names needed to be removed from various documents. But I also made a harder list. What parts of my identity had become so intertwined with Victoria that I'd forgotten who I was before her, and which pieces of myself I could get back? Music came back first. I picked up my old guitar for the first time in over a year, and my fingers stumbled over chords that used to be as familiar as breathing. But the sound. God, the sound was purely mine. Unfiltered, honest, free from the need to impress anyone or fit into someone else's idea of what my interests should be. I played for hours that night, completely losing track of time until I realized the sun had gone down, and I was sitting in darkness. It was the smallest victory imaginable, but it felt like learning how to breathe again. Then one afternoon, as I was leaving the grocery store with a bag of essentials and no particular plan for the evening, I ran into someone from my past. Not Victoria, thank God, but someone who represented a completely different chapter of my life. It was Sophia. We'd dated back in college for a few months before life did what life does and pulled us in different directions. She looked exactly the same as I remembered her. Sharp, intelligent eyes and hair that always seemed just slightly untamed, like she'd always been a half step out of sync with the rest of the world in the absolute best way possible. She recognized me first. "Tyler," she said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice that I hadn't heard from anyone in months. I nodded, managing what felt like my first real smile in weeks. "Hey, wow, it's been years!" "It really has," she said, and we fell into an easy conversation right there in the parking lot. What struck me most about talking to Sophia was how natural it felt. She didn't ask about Victoria, didn't probe into why I looked like I'd been through a war, didn't offer unsolicited advice about moving on or healing. She just talked to me like I was Tyler, not the husband, not the betrayed, not the guy whose wife had cheated on him. Just me, the person I'd been before I'd let someone else's expectations and disappointments reshape me into something smaller. We only talked for maybe 15 minutes, but it was the first conversation I'd had in months that felt completely authentic. When we said goodbye, I realized I'd spent a quarter of an hour being myself without having to think about it, without having to manage someone else's emotions or navigate around their guilt or anger. That night, I lay on my mattress on the floor and thought about how dramatically different everything looked from this new perspective. I wasn't healed yet. I knew that much about myself. The wound was still fresh, still tender to the touch, but I was no longer actively bleeding, and that had to count for something. I still had that flash drive tucked away in my dresser drawer, the one with all the evidence of Victoria's affair. Photos, emails, text message screenshots, a complete digital paper trail that spelled out exactly who she'd chosen to become when she thought no one was watching. Part of me wanted to delete it all, to just wipe away every trace of her betrayal and pretend it had never happened. Another part of me wanted to print everything out and mail copies to every mutual friend who still thought she was just going through a rough patch or finding herself. But I didn't do either of those things. The truth didn't need to be weaponized anymore. It just needed to be remembered, acknowledged, and then filed away where it belonged, in the past. It had been 4 weeks since I'd left that house. 4 weeks since I'd walked out of the life we'd built together. Time moved differently after something like that. Some mornings, I'd wake up feeling like I was still trapped in the middle of the wreckage, still processing the shock of discovery. Other days, I'd almost forget how heavy everything had been, how much effort it had taken just to get through a single day without falling apart completely. But one thing never changed during those weeks. Victoria stayed gone. Or rather, I stayed gone from her. Her name appeared on my phone exactly once more during that time, an unknown number that left me a voicemail I didn't bother listening to. Instead, I read the automated transcript that my phone generated. "Just wanted you to know I moved out," the text version of her message read. "Blake's gone too. It's just me now, not asking for anything, just thought you should hear it from me." I stared at those words for a long time, particularly the part about Blake being gone. I could have predicted that outcome from day one. Guys like him aren't built for dealing with the aftermath of their actions. They're built for the secret meetings, the adrenaline rush of sneaking around, the novelty of a forbidden relationship. But the moment real consequences step into the picture, the moment the fantasy becomes messy reality, they vanish like smoke. And Victoria was left alone with the version of herself she'd tried so desperately to escape from. There was something almost poetic about that, but I didn't feel bad for her. I felt bad for the version of myself that would have dropped everything to comfort her, the man who would have held her while she cried about the hole she'd dug for herself. That man was dead now, and I didn't miss him. I made the decision to start therapy about 6 weeks after I'd left. I didn't announce it to anyone or make a big deal about it. I just walked into a clean, professional office downtown and told a complete stranger what it felt like to stop trusting the person who used to represent your entire future. The therapist was a calm, soft-spoken guy named Marcus who had this way of asking questions that stopped me cold and made me really examine things I'd been taking for granted. During our very first session, he asked me something that completely rewound my entire understanding of my relationship with Victoria. "What do you think you learned to tolerate that you should have walked away from long ago?" That question hit me like a freight train. It forced me to rewind through years of our relationship, looking at moments I'd written off as normal relationship struggles with completely new eyes. The way Victoria would mock my routines and call them boring. How she'd deliberately leave me out of social events that mattered to her, then expect me to be enthusiastically supportive when she needed something from me. The way she'd stopped asking about my day, stopped showing interest in my work or my thoughts or my dreams. Most damaging of all was how every single disagreement we'd had somehow became my fault. I was too sensitive, too demanding, too emotional. I didn't understand her needs, didn't appreciate her enough, didn't give her the space she required to be herself. It wasn't just the affair that had destroyed us. That was just the final, most dramatic betrayal in a long line of smaller ones. What I realized in that therapist's office was that there had been a slow, systematic erasure of who I was, and I'd allowed it to happen in the name of compromise and understanding. I'd kept showing up with more patience, more empathy, more of myself, until there was almost nothing left of me to give. Victoria had been sanding down my edges for years, and I'd mistaken that process for love. I walked home from that therapy session in a kind of daze, my mind spinning with this new understanding of what had really been happening between us. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I let myself feel the real grief, not just for the marriage that had ended, but for the man I used to be before I met her. I sat on the cold floor of my apartment that night and just let it all wash over me. The anger, the sorrow, the sense of betrayal, the regret for all the times I'd silenced my own instincts to keep the peace. I let it run through me like a tide, and I didn't try to hold any of it back or manage it or make it more palatable. It came out raw and honest, and then eventually it passed. The next morning, I woke up feeling clearer than I had in months. Not healed. That was still going to take time, but definitely lighter, like I'd finally set down a weight I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. I started doing things purely for myself. I cooked real meals again, not just sandwiches and takeout containers eaten standing over the kitchen sink. I deleted old photos from my phone, not in a rage-fueled purge, but because I didn't need those ghosts haunting my digital life anymore. I started going to the gym regularly and even ran into a coworker I hadn't seen in over a year. He asked how Victoria was doing, and I just said, "We're not together anymore." Simple, direct, no drama or explanation required. He nodded and didn't pry, which was exactly the kind of empathy I needed. The kind that didn't demand details or try to fix anything. Weeks passed quietly after that. No more dramatic confrontations, no more desperate messages, no more surprise visits to motel rooms. Victoria had simply vanished from my world, like she'd been edited out of the story entirely. I was building a new routine, a new normal, a new version of myself that didn't require her approval or presence to function. Then one night I opened my email and found something I hadn't expected at all. A message from Blake, with no subject line, just his name in the sender field. I almost deleted it without reading it. What could he possibly have to say to me? But curiosity got the better of me. "I owe you an apology," the message began. I didn't think it would go as far as it did. It started off as something stupid, just flirting at the office. I didn't know she was married at first, and when I found out, I guess I didn't care enough to stop. "I'm not writing this to ask for your forgiveness. I just wanted to say that I was wrong, and you didn't deserve what we did to you." That was it. No lengthy justification, no attempt to minimize his role in what had happened, no dramatic plea for understanding. It was more sincere and straightforward than anything I'd ever gotten from Victoria, which made me hate it even more. I didn't reply to his message. Some things don't need closure or acknowledgement. Some things just need to be left exactly where they collapsed, in the rubble of what used to be. I closed my laptop after reading Blake's message and realized something that caught me completely off guard. I hadn't thought about Victoria once that entire day. Not when I woke up, not during my morning coffee, not while I was running errands or cooking dinner. She had simply not existed in my mental space for 24 consecutive hours. It was a Saturday when I saw her again, completely by accident. I was walking out of the hardware store with a bag of light bulbs and a new shower head tucked under my arm, trying to remember if I still had a decent wrench somewhere in my apartment. The sun was sharp and bright, the sky too blue for anything heavy or dramatic to happen. I wasn't thinking about her, not even peripherally. That part of my mind had been blissfully quiet lately. But there she was, standing by the flower stall on the corner with her phone in one hand and holding a bouquet of white roses in the other. She looked smaller than I remembered her being. Not physically smaller, but somehow reduced, like life had taken her down several notches since the last time she tried to talk her way out of the mess she'd created. She didn't notice me at first, which gave me a moment to observe her without the complication of interaction. I could have easily turned around and walked in the opposite direction, could have avoided this encounter entirely, but I didn't. Something made me stay right where I was, about 10 feet away, waiting to see if she'd eventually notice me standing there. When she finally did look up from her phone, it happened slowly. Her eyes flicked from her screen to somewhere in the middle distance, then paused and tilted slightly toward where I was standing. Recognition dawned gradually across her face, and her mouth opened slightly like she might say something. She didn't, though. I gave her one small nod, not a smile, not a frown, just a simple acknowledgement. The kind of gesture that says, "Yeah, I see you. You're still breathing, still moving through the world." Noted. Then I turned and walked away without looking back. She didn't follow me or call out my name. She just let me go. It wasn't until I reached my car in the parking lot that I realized my hands were shaking slightly. But it wasn't from anger or sadness or any of the emotions I might have expected. It was something much stranger and more liberating. Relief. Relief because I had felt absolutely nothing when I saw her. The woman who had once meant everything to me, who had been the center of my universe for years, was now just someone I used to know. There was no bitterness, no residual heat, no unfinished emotional business, just complete peaceful neutrality. She had become like an old book that used to make you cry, something you could respect for what it once meant to you, but had absolutely no desire to read again. I sat in my car for a few minutes, processing this unexpected encounter and marveling at how different my reaction had been from what I would have imagined months ago. The old version of me would have gone home and replayed those 30 seconds 100 times, analyzing every detail of her appearance and demeanor, wondering what she was thinking, and whether she was happy or sad or regretful. But this new version of me didn't need to analyze anything. There was nothing left to dig into, no hidden meanings to uncover, no emotional archaeology to conduct. I was simply done with all of it. I drove home, changed that shower head I'd bought, put on some music I'd been rediscovering, and ordered Thai food from a place Victoria had never liked. The simplicity of that evening felt like a quiet celebration, a recognition of the new rhythm I'd been building, one that didn't include her at all. That night, I opened up a cheap spiral-bound notebook I'd tossed in a drawer months earlier and started writing. Not a letter to her, not an angry rant, just truths I was finally ready to acknowledge. Things I'd learned about myself, about what I'd tolerated, about what I was reclaiming piece by piece. One line stood out as I wrote it. Love shouldn't feel like constantly managing someone else's disappointment in you. I wrote that sentence down twice, underlining it the second time. Then I picked up my phone and texted David, asking if he wanted to grab a drink the next time he was in town. He replied almost instantly, "Hell yes, proud of you, man." It felt like the first real step forward I'd taken that came from choice rather than survival. And that night, as I turned off the lights in my new place, still mostly bare, still echoing with the emptiness of starting over, I didn't feel alone. I felt free. There's something profoundly strange about freedom when you finally have it after years of not even realizing you'd lost it. At first, it feels like floating untethered through space. Every day too quiet, too open, too full of possibilities you'd forgotten how to recognize. And then, slowly and almost imperceptibly, it transforms into structure. Not the kind of structure someone else builds around you with their needs and expectations, but the kind you create for yourself, brick by brick, without needing anyone's permission or approval. 3 months had passed since I'd left Victoria. 3 whole months. It still felt surreal when I said it out loud to myself. We're not together anymore. Not because I missed her. Those feelings had dissolved into dust and blown away. But because I'd never imagined I would be the one to walk away. I'd always assumed that if our relationship ever ended, it would be her doing the leaving. She'd be the one with the dramatically half-zipped suitcase, storming out while blaming me for not being enough or giving her what she needed. But no, she stayed in the ashes of what we'd built together, and I walked out of the fire. I'd started seeing someone new. Well, not exactly dating in any traditional sense, more like orbiting around each other with careful curiosity. Her name was Sophia. Yes, the same Sophia I'd run into at the grocery store. After that initial encounter, we'd met at a bookstore a few days later. And yes, it really was as ridiculously perfect as it sounds. We both reached for the same Raymond Carver collection at exactly the same moment. She'd laughed and let me take the book, and I'd offered to buy her coffee as a thank you. She'd said yes without hesitation, which surprised me. That was 2 weeks ago now, and we'd met up twice since then. We talked about books and music and life in general, but not once did she ask about Victoria. Not once did she push for details about my past or try to rush into anything more serious than conversation. Because she didn't demand explanations, I found myself telling her more than I'd expected to share. I told her I'd been married and that it had ended badly. I told her I wasn't ready for anything serious or complicated. But I also told her that I liked talking to her, liked the way she listened without trying to fix things or offer advice I hadn't asked for. She'd smiled at my honesty and said, "Cool, I like talking to you too. No expectations, no pressure, no hidden agenda. Just space to breathe and be myself without having to perform or manage anyone else's emotions." That night, I lay on my mattress, the same one, still sitting directly on the floor because I hadn't bothered buying a bed frame yet, and realized something remarkable. I hadn't thought about Victoria in days. Not with anger, not with pain, not even with the distant curiosity you might feel about a stranger's life. When her memory did surface, it was with the same emotional detachment I might feel when remembering a city I'd once gotten lost in, but would never need to visit again. Then I got the letter. Not an email or a text message, but an actual, physical letter written by hand and mailed through the postal service like it was 1995. It had been forwarded from my old address, tucked into a plain white envelope with no return name, just her familiar handwriting that I recognized instantly. I almost didn't open it. I held that envelope for a long time, weighing it in my hands, wondering what she could possibly have to say that hadn't already been said. But curiosity won out, and I carefully tore it open. It was 4 pages long, written in dark blue ink on lined paper with no paragraph breaks. Just a continuous stream of consciousness that spilled across the pages like water finding its way downhill. She said she was sorry, that she was in therapy now, that she'd finally realized she'd been slowly poisoning every relationship she touched because she was terrified of being ordinary or predictable. She wrote about how Blake had abandoned her the moment she'd started falling apart emotionally, how she woke up every morning wondering if she'd made a mistake that could never be undone. She said she missed me, missed us, missed the quiet domestic things we'd shared. The coffee in the morning, my stupid humming when I cooked dinner, the way I always checked all the locks twice before bed. I thought I wanted fireworks, she wrote in her messy, hurried script, but it turns out I had the stars the whole time. I just couldn't see them. She claimed she wasn't writing to try to win me back, but I knew that was a lie. Even now, with everything between us reduced to absolute rubble, she still wanted to control the narrative. She still wanted to be the author of our story's ending. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope, then slid it into a drawer I never opened. Not out of sentiment or some misguided hope for reconciliation, but out of respect for the wreckage. I needed a place for it to exist that wasn't inside my head or my heart anymore. The next day, I saw Sophia again. She was wearing an oversized sweater that made her look impossibly cozy, and she ordered green tea instead of coffee while telling me about a short film she was working on for her graduate program. I found myself genuinely listening to every word, watching the way her hands moved when she got excited about a particular shot or editing technique. I caught myself staring at her hands at one point, wondering what it would feel like to reach across the small cafe table and take one of them in mine. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel guilt about having that thought. I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Real, cautious, unfamiliar hope that wasn't built on the wreckage of something broken. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving the aftermath of someone else's choices. I was actively building something honest and new. Fall arrived early that year. The air shifted in that quiet, invisible way it always does, bringing cooler mornings and the first yellow leaves twitching on tree branches. Sunlight started fading earlier each day, and I caught myself standing at the window of my apartment one evening, watching the wind stir a pile of dead leaves in the parking lot below. It felt like a metaphor that was almost too obvious, too perfectly symbolic. Everything old was falling away, making space for whatever came next. I never responded to Victoria's letter, and I never planned to. There wasn't anything left to say between us. She had spoken her piece, laid out her regrets and justifications and hopes for redemption, and now it was done. The conversation was over, even if only one of us knew it. Sophia and I kept seeing each other, still casually, still taking things slowly, but with an honesty that felt revolutionary after years of walking on eggshells. It was the first real connection I'd had in so long that didn't come with tension or second-guessing or the exhausting work of managing someone else's insecurities. We could sit together in comfortable silence without feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation. She didn't chase validation or turn every interaction into some kind of emotional performance. When she asked questions, they came from genuine curiosity rather than a desire to control or manipulate. She asked me once very gently, "What do you think love is supposed to feel like now?" I paused for a long moment, really considering the question. "I think love is when your peace grows around someone," I finally said, "not when you have to constantly fight to protect it from them." She smiled at that and actually wrote it down in her phone, like it was something worth remembering. The old me would have been paranoid about Victoria somehow finding out about Sophia, would have worried about whether she was stalking my social media or asking mutual friends about my life. But that old version of me didn't live in this apartment. He didn't pay rent here, didn't even get mail forwarded to this address. I stopped checking the drawer where I'd put Victoria's letter. I stopped replaying old memories like they were some kind of greatest hits album of heartbreak. I realized I hadn't even dreamed about her in over a month, which was remarkable considering those strange, disjointed dreams used to happen almost every night. In those dreams, she would still laugh like nothing had happened, and I'd wake up feeling disoriented and sick with the contrast between Dream Victoria and reality. Not anymore. Even my subconscious had moved on. But then came one final complication. One last attempt to pull me back into the orbit of her chaos. Victoria's mother reached out to me on a Sunday afternoon while I was walking through the farmer's market with Sophia, both of us holding cups of hot apple cider and laughing about something completely inconsequential. Patricia had always liked me. Maybe too much sometimes. She was the kind of woman who meddled gently but persistently, sending holiday texts and birthday cards, buying me novelty socks that said, "Best son-in-law ever," even though Victoria and I had only been married for 2 years. Her message was short and direct. "I know you don't owe anyone anything, but Vic isn't doing well. I think she's really unraveling. If nothing else, could you call her just once?" I stood there in the middle of the bustling market, holding warm cider while a chill cut through my jacket, feeling reality crash back into my peaceful afternoon like a slap. Sophia saw the expression on my face and didn't ask what was wrong. She just waited patiently while I showed her the message. She read it carefully, then looked at me with a strange mix of understanding and absolute clarity. "You don't have to be her hero," she said simply. And I knew she was right. It wasn't my job to catch Victoria from whatever fall she'd chosen for herself. Helping her now wouldn't heal her or teach her anything meaningful about consequences. It would just feed the lie she'd always told herself. That I would always be there. That I couldn't really leave. That no matter what she did, I'd eventually crawl back. But I wasn't crawling anymore. I was standing upright, whole, maybe still a little bruised but no longer broken. I didn't reply to Patricia's message. Not out of spite or cruelty, but out of pure survival instinct. Because responding to Patricia's plea wouldn't have helped Victoria heal from her self-inflicted wounds. It would have just reinforced the toxic pattern she'd always relied on, that I would always be her safety net. That my love was unconditional enough to survive any betrayal. That she could destroy something sacred and still expect me to help her pick up the pieces. But I wasn't that person anymore. I had learned the difference between being loving and being a fool, between forgiveness and enabling someone's worst behaviors. Sophia squeezed my hand gently as we continued walking through the farmer's market. The air around us smelled like cinnamon and fresh apples, and somewhere in the distance, a child was laughing while someone played guitar. For a moment, everything felt perfectly still in the best possible way. Not frozen or stagnant, but anchored. Peaceful. I wasn't drifting anymore, wasn't being pulled in directions I didn't want to go. I had made it out of the storm, and I wasn't looking back. I never thought there would be a single moment where I could say with complete certainty that it was truly over. Not just the marriage, not just the betrayal, but the grip that entire experience had held on my mind and heart. But that moment came quietly, without fanfare or dramatic revelation. I was standing in my kitchen on a Thursday evening, barefoot and chopping onions for dinner. Music was playing in the background. Some old indie track that used to soundtrack our college years, a song that would have knocked the wind out of me just a year ago. It would have brought back memories of road trips and late-night pizza runs, of the first apartment we'd shared when everything still felt possible and good. But that night, it was just a song. I didn't flinch when it came on, didn't feel that familiar tug of nostalgia trying to pull me backward. I didn't sink into sadness or get lost in what-if scenarios. I just smiled and kept chopping onions. That was it. The last ember finally went dark, and all that remained was clarity. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. How it had started with those gut feelings I'd ignored, because I loved her too much to believe she'd ever cut that deep. The missed calls and late nights, the subtle emotional distancing that I'd rationalized away. Then the truth crashing down piece by piece until I was surrounded by the broken glass of everything I'd believed about our relationship. I remembered the confrontation, how she'd twisted guilt like origami, folding her lies into half-truths and deflections until somehow she was the victim in the story she'd authored. I remembered the rage and the numbness, and finally, the day I left. That sticky note. I finally had enough. That had been the real turning point, not the moment I walked out the door, but the second I wrote those words. Because that was the first time I'd told the truth out loud, both to her and to myself. She had broken something sacred between us, but I had built something better from the wreckage. It wasn't just about leaving her. It was about coming back to myself. The man I'd stopped recognizing in the mirror. The version of me that used to laugh at his own jokes, that played guitar without worrying about disturbing anyone, that planned spontaneous weekend hikes. that didn't need to shrink himself to fit into someone else's fragile ego. That man was home again, and this time no one could take that away from me. Sophia and I didn't become some fairy tale overnight. What we had wasn't love at first sight or fireworks exploding across the sky. It was something much more valuable, a slow burn that felt real and respectful and safe. Not boring or cold, but safe in the way a steady heartbeat is safe. In the way being truly seen and not judged is safe. She never tried to replace what I'd lost or compete with ghost memories. Instead, she helped me remember what I never should have given up in the first place. My own sense of worth, my own voice, my own right to be loved without conditions or constant compromise. If you're reading this and you recognize yourself in where I was, second-guessing every instinct, bending yourself into impossible shapes to be enough for someone, swallowing your own needs for the sake of keeping peace, I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me earlier. You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. And you are absolutely allowed to walk away from someone who swore they loved you, but proved otherwise through their actions. Love doesn't require self-abandonment. It shouldn't feel like betrayal dressed up as romance, and healing isn't about getting back what you had. It's about realizing you deserve so much more than what broke you in the first place. Victoria will always be a chapter in my story, but she's not the ending. She's not even close to the ending. She's the lesson that taught me the difference between loving someone and losing yourself, between commitment and self-destruction. And I finally closed that book for good.